Hi lovelies, welcome back to the Geek Suite. I'm your host, the one and only Kidner Bean, and we're back in my kitchen for round 2 of Geek Suite Brews beer. So in our first video, we did our quarantine Kolsch, which we'll be tasting later today at the end of the video. It's finally ready. And today we're going to be starting our second batch, which is going to be a brown ale. So the first step we're doing is we are bringing our first set of water, 4.5 cups, up to our steeping temperature of 155 degrees, and then we're going to steep our single step mash at that for an hour to an hour and a half before we start extracting the wort, which I will go over in the next step. All right, let's get brewing. Okay, so we have reached our desired steeping temperature. So I have poured all of my malt, which I showed you guys earlier, into a wonderful cheesecloth sock. But if you don't get one of these socks from the brew shop, you can always just make your own by tying some cheesecloth together with some twine, and I have hung it from the side of the handle, and we are going to let that steep with our dry malt extract for about an hour to an hour and a half. And then at that point, we'll be ready for sparging. Okay, so I'm just gonna come in here and give a little home brewing tip, piece of advice. So we're doing a single step mash, which according to the recipes means that you put in your malt and your grains and your dry malt extract in together at the same time. And a critical point when doing this is to slowly add the dry malt extract and make sure you have some hot water standing by, because what we just did was we dumped it all in at once, and it didn't look like there was enough water in my pot, just eyeballing it, but the water calculator for the homebrew kit, according to all of my grains and brew time and stuff, I typed everything in, told me I had enough to get started, and it was super wrong. And the dry malt extract started to solidify right away, so we had to add a lot more water, I think about an additional 4 cups. So now we're letting that get back up to temperature, hoping it doesn't screw everything up too bad. And then once that's ready, we're gonna slowly add in the rest of the dry malt extract till we get our desired measurements, and then we're gonna let that steep for an hour. So yes, it is critical, even if you're doing a single step mash, when you're adding the dry malt extract, to do it a little bit at a time, like you do when adding ingredients when you're baking. Add it in, you let it mix, you add it in, you let it mix, and if you need more water, make sure you add it. Ideally, you would have maybe an electric kettle standing by so you can add hot water so you don't screw up the temperature. But yeah, just thought I'd go in and share that. Okay, so now that we've had that one slight misstep, we're gonna go ahead and keep going. All right, guys. About the steeping is that you want to maintain temperature, but you also want to keep it covered so you lock in those flavors. So when you're ready to put the lid on, make sure you turn down the flame just a little bit if you're using a gas stove, and be sure to go back and check the temperature after a couple of minutes to make sure that you're maintaining that 154 to 156 ideal temperature for the steeping of the mash. finally steeping done. And so now I am heating some water in my electric kettle so we can add our 3 liters or about a gallon's worth of water for the sparging. And for our new home brewers, sparging is when you take your little tea bag type cheesecloth filled with the malt and you pour the hot water directly through it to get that really sweet, really extracted form of the liquid that you're adding into your steep, which is called the wort. And I made a note of that in my earlier video but didn't quite explain what that was, so just going through and making sure everyone knows what that is and what we're doing. We didn't do sparging for the Kolsch recipe, but the brown ale recipe does prefer that you do it that way. Alright, so once our water is nice and hot, but no hotter than 175, we will begin the sparging process. Slowly in a gradated steps. It says to sparge for 1 hour, but this is really heavy and I can't stand there and hold it for that long, so we're going to do it as slowly and as well as possible. For a 1 gallon brew. I know a lot of homebrew stores and homebrew groups will tell you to start with a 5 gallon brew, but we don't really have the storage for that, and especially if you're just starting out and you want to know if it's good or not, you feel less bad about wasting a gallon's worth of bad beer than 5. Okay, and so while we're waiting for our last liter of water for sparging to be ready in the electric kettle, I did want to comment briefly on the importance of sanitization when you're doing home brew. Now, it's important to make sure that all of your cooking materials and products that you're going to be using when creating a home brew kit are sanitized and clean, but the real critical point is to make sure that your fermenter and all of the equipment that goes on post-boil is what's sanitized. So, like, I washed my pot when I was doing dishes, and the spoon is clean, and everything when you're creating the wort needs to be clean and sanitized when it comes into contact, but it's really not super critical if it's not, restaurant grade sanitized, gonna survive COVID-19 type. super clean because it's all going to cook out during the boil. It's what happens post-boil that's really important. So right now I've got one side of my sink, which I'm not going to show you because it's not camera ready, is filled with a industrial grade cleaner, which I will leave a link to in the description section down below. You can get them from pretty much any homebrew shop. I ordered mine on Amazon because you could get the two products together for a cheap price, so that was great. So I've got my fermenter and my pressurized stopper being sanitized in the solution right now, so that way I can drain that side of the sink and fill it with an ice bath when it's time to bring our brew down to fermenting temperature. So just wanted to get that out of the way that yes, anything that's going to touch or hold the beer after you do the boil with the hops, which we're going to be doing after we're done sparging, is what's going to need to be sanitized. And there's a specific list of products that you can use to make sure that your equipment is sanitized at home, and be sure that when you're dealing with the sanitization products that you're wearing gloves because they are rather harsh and can burn your skin. So safety first, my lovelies. Always, always safety first. And drink. Ooh, that sound means our last liter of water is ready for sparging, so let's go. Now, our recipe said to sparge for 1 hour. I feel like Dr. Evil doing all these air quotes all the time. Which is what they really want you to do, is to slowly pour it over an hour, and there's usually special equipment you can have to do that. But as I've mentioned, my grain pack is very heavy and we don't have that equipment, so I've tried pouring as slowly as I can. And now I would say we spent about 10 minutes doing 5 to 10 minutes doing the actual pour over sparging. And so now I'm going to spend the next few minutes just doing that press that I was doing with the spoon, like I talked about when you make tea the wrong way. That's the right way to make beer. So I'm going to do that for a little bit, and then it'll be time to bring it up to a boil and add the hops. Sock that we got from the Hombrew shop, it is a little bit less tightly woven than your standard cheesecloth, so if you're doing the spoon press, please be careful not to rupture the bag. Be very gentle, because you don't want your beer grains to go everywhere, because then you'll need to get a spider or some sort of sifter to try to get them out, and it really just kind of messes up the whole boil process once you get to that part the next step. Wort, which is the sweetest extract from our grains and our malt. So I'm going to remove my beer tea bag and bring the wort to a boil, and once that boil starts, then we get to add our hops and our flavors to our brown ale. All right, let's get started. Alrighty, so our wort has started boiling, so now it's time to add the hops. So our first step for this recipe, which I again will link in the description section down below, is that we're going to be adding, since it's a 1 gallon boil, 0.4 4 ounces, which I measured, I'll show you the picture, with a food scale of our Northern Brewing hops, and we will leave that for 20 minutes, and then we will add our next step from that point. So for our total hop brewing, it's going to be 1 hour, a 60-minute boil. All right, let's continue. And if you notice any foam at the top of your brew, don't worry about it. It will naturally dissolve. A lot of the homebrew recipes and homebrew websites will tell you that, so don't worry about skimming or scraping it off. It'll take care of itself throughout the course of the boil. All right, and my partner is preparing our sani bath. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, commenting about the importance of sanitization post-brew. Now, I mentioned don't worry about the foam that may be on the top of your brew while you're boiling, but it is very important that from this point on, we don't cover the brew mix because we don't want to trap in those flavors. We want everything to just sort of boil and brew out up until the last little bit. So from this point on, we're leaving an open boil. All right, and I just want to give a huge shout out to all the people who have helped us in our homebrew process, which is our local homebrew group, the SoCal Cerveceros, and their sub-branch of the Lady Brewers, the SoCal Cerveceras, and to our Monrovia homebrew shop where we got all of our supplies for this brew and our quarantine Kolsch brew. I will leave links down in the description section for our local homebrew shop and our local homebrew group, which is a Latinx and now just broadly spread to a diversity-based homebrew club in the greater Los Angeles area. So if you're interested in joining or learning more information about homebrewing and the resources that are available to you in the SoCal area, these are great places to start. All right, so we've got about 45 more minutes for our boil. So our next step is going to be coming up in a couple of minutes where we add our Whirlfloc tab, and we will get to that shortly. Okay, so as I mentioned, our next step is going to be adding a Whirlfloc tablet, which I can show you here. This is the brand we're using, and it's an optional step in this brew and the last brew, for which we both opted in for that because we want our brew to come out super great. But for those who may be wondering, what do Whirlfloc tablets do? Whirlfloc tablets are a blend of Irish moss, and this one is refined Carrigan, and what these do is they encourage precipitation of the hazy causing ingredients in our brew batch. So if you're brewing a hazy IPA or a hazy beer, you're not going to want to add these, but what these do for our brown ale and for our quarantine Kolsch was that they made sure that all of the hazy components of the beer precipitate or evaporate out of our beer. So we are going to be including this. We're using 1/5 of a tablet since our recipe was designed for a 5-gallon brew, but as I've mentioned repeatedly, we're only doing 1-gallon brews because we don't have the space to store 5-gallon brews, and since these are our first 2 brews, we want to make sure that if they don't turn out great, which I'm hoping they will, we'll get to see how our quarantine Kolsch turns out at the end of the video, that if we do, well, we've only lost 1 gallon. All right, so let's get to adding our Whirlfloc tab. All right, so we're 20 minutes into our boil, so it's time to add our 1/5 of a Whirlfloc tablet. And for those who are maybe concerned that your, foamy stuff isn't going to boil out, ours was basically covered all the way across the top when we started our boil, but if you'll see, now it's coming down to a much less bubbly consistency and it's starting to skirt towards the edges. So yes, I was serious when I meant that it's not going to need to be skimmed off the top. It will boil out. So don't worry, my lovelies, if you're worried about any of the foamy type stuff or bubbles on the top of your brew. All right, so now there's 15 minutes left in the boil, so that means that we're gonna throw in our second round of hops, which again is the Northern Brew hops according to our recipe, and then we'll be adding the Cascade, but we've substituted that for the Fuggle hops since that was what was available at our brew shop and recommended by the brew shop owners to substitute for when we get closer down to the 0-minute mark. All right, so we've got our hops, let's add them in. All right, and now that we're at 10 minutes left, it's time to add our third round of hops, which is going to be our second strain of hops, which is the Fuggle hops, which we're using as a substitute for the Cascade hops. So we've got them here. We add half now and half at the end of the boil, where we then turn off the heat, and cover it with a sanitized lid. So, let's go. Alright, so we've reached the end of our 60-minute brew. So now it's time to add the last section of hops. See, there's the timer. And cover it with our freshly sanitized lid because, as I mentioned, everything that is going to touch or involve the beer post-boil needs to be sanitized. So, we're going to add our last bit of the Cascade, or if you're following my recipe where we've substituted for the Fuggle hops, we're going to add our hops here and turn off the heat. And now it is time to cool it to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and the way we're going to be doing that is by using an ice bath. So we're going to take our whole pot with the sanitized lid, put it in our ice bath, and once it has reached 68 degrees, we will go ahead and pitch our yeast. All right, let's go back to waiting. That's right. You act like that, you ain't gonna stay in my bar. Off with you. Go on, go on. Get out of here. Alright. Sorry about that. It's always nice to see a friendly face here in the Geek Suite Tavern. Come on in, come up, have a drink. Let's get in out of the heat. Put this away. Don't you pay them no mind, love. That there plague out there is giving everybody the crazies. Don't you worry about that. You come on in here and we'll get you all nice and settled up. What can I get for you, love? Can I get you your usual? No? No. Looking for something new? Well, I think I can help you there. Let's see. We've got our freshest cold brew coming in from the west. Calling it our quarantine Kolsch. Let me go ahead and get you a taste. Alright, here you go, love. I'll pour one for myself as well. And just feel free to leave your gratuity in our lovely tip jug as well. Alright, my love. Cheers. Really good. Yes, it's nice and sweet, not too harsh. Perfect for those hard summer days that are coming our ways. Alrighty, my lovelies. I'll go ahead and leave the rest with you. You go ahead and enjoy, and you stay safe out there. Cheers. You can taste the fizz, but it's not like super bubbly like you would expect a crisp Kolsch to be. It may need a little bit more time.
Yeah, we'll probably keep it in there for a couple more weeks.
Still pretty tasty.